7. The ones who stayed.
In the hollowed-out, emptied heart of Addis Ababa, two men stood as the final barricades against the erasure of memory: Ngishu and Abuli. They had been presented with the official solutions of the state, vouchers for concrete studios in the barren winds of Yeka Abado and nameless apartment blocks in the dust of Bole Arapsa. They journeyed there once, standing amidst the sterile, unfinished skeletons of the relocation sites, and felt the silence of places without history. They turned back toward the center without hesitation. "There is no life beyond the heart," Ngish had said, his voice a quiet verdict. In the logic of the developers, they were choosing homelessness. In the logic of the ancestors, they were choosing dignity over mere shelter. For 40 nights, they formed a small, defiant constellation of humanity along Ras Nahom. They sat huddled by the half-standing wall of 647, where the phantom scent of jasmine still lingered. Nahom had dragged the legendary 60-year-old sofa into the open air, a final throne for Abuli's weary frame. But the task force returned with the cruelty of those who fear what they cannot understand. They set the sofa ablaze, watching as Abuli's few remaining clothes, folded neatly on the armrest, were consumed by
the flame. The smoke rose thin, gray, and bitter, the literal last breath of Kazanchis herself drifting toward the indifferent stars. Months they endured in hardship like the patriots and heroes of old, until came the day that severed the final thread, the day that ended the old world. Ngishu's body, seasoned by a lifetime of laughter but weakened by the sudden onslaught of hunger and the pulverized dust of his neighborhood, finally gave out. In a cruel irony, his neighbors buried him in the distant soil of Arabza, the very place he had refused to inhabit while he drew breath. He was laid to rest in exile. Before the sun could set on that same tragic day, Abu Lay had vanished. One moment he was a physical presence guarding the ruins, the next there was only the sound of the wind. No trace was found. Some whispered that he had followed Ngishu into the earth out of grief too heavy to carry. Others believed he simply walked into the veins of the city until he became part of her immortal spirit. Ras Nahom speaks their names every time he crosses that sacred ground, not as an act of mourning, but as a liturgy of prayer. To remember Ngishu and Abu Lay is to affirm that dignity can exist without walls, that belonging is never granted by a government decree. It is a sovereign choice made by the soul. They remain the eternal gatekeepers of the heart of hearts.
Spirit architecture.
After the day Ngish passed and Abu Lala vanished, the silence in Kazanchis underwent a profound transformation. It was no longer the hollow hush of abandonment or the static noise of a neighborhood in mourning. It had become a listening silence. It was the expectant pause that precedes a storm or a long-awaited voice. Ras Nahom understood with terrifying clarity that if he walked away, the erasure would be absolute. The heart of hearts would not just be demolished, she would be unwritten. Memory itself would turn to fine gray dust and blow away into the indifferent streets of the corridor. So he stayed. He became a living monument, walking the same paths each dawn, tracing the invisible geometry of what had once been the house of the colonel, the sanctuary of the schools, the first mosque, the best everything, the jazz-soaked cafes and the resonant laughter of the mothers. He spoke their names aloud to the empty air, until the atmosphere itself seemed to learn the phonetics of his history and began to answer.
Rubble. Epigraphy.
At first, the words were a litany for the dead, but as the sun rose higher over the ruins, they became a manifesto for the living. He began to write, not with the luxury of pen and parchment, but on the raw skin of the wreckage. He used whatever he could scavenge, the backs of faded receipts, scraps of torn cardboard, and the soot-stained plaster of half-collapsed walls. He wrote of Colonel Teferiden's incorruptible honor, of Wosin's quiet strength, of the neighbors who had cultivated lives of immense dignity without the validation of wealth. He wrote of the children, the sons of vision, who had once played in the sacred space between Adwa and Omedla. The city's heart, he scrawled in charcoal, is not composed of concrete and steel. It is forged from conscience.
Wall of prayers.
The city began to notice the writings. Security guards on their night shifts, taxi drivers pausing in the dust, street sweepers, and the hollow-eyed, displaced men who returned to search for the remains of their lives, they all stopped to read. The ruins had become a public ledger. One evening, a young boy approached Nahom, offering a small piece of chalk. He asked if he could write too. Then another came, and another. Soon, the standing fragments of Khazanchis were covered in messages that looked like prayers carved into the living stone. Remember us.
Homes are not crimes.
The living protect the dead. The dead guide the living.
Addis belongs to her children.
The birth of hybrid vision.
Out of this quiet, communal defiance, a singular vision began to take form. Nahom called it hybrid vision. It was not a political party or a temporary movement. It was a way of seeing. It was the radical proposition that the old and the new are not enemies, but parts of one continuous body. It was the wisdom of the emperors joined to the raw courage of the poor, the disciplined memory of the colonel joined to the hungry ambition of the youth. It was progress without betrayal, modernity that possessed a soul. When people asked for his program, he answered with the simplicity of a man who had slept on ash. To rebuild Addis, we must first remember what she was built for, not for power, but for the people. He began gathering the true at heart, artisans whose hands missed the feel of timber, students who questioned the cold blueprints of their professors, and mothers who had lost their hearths but not their voices. They met in the ruins at night, huddled around small fires that looked like fallen stars. They shared what little bread they had and traded stories.
Like currency. No one gave orders. There were no exact lines of hierarchy. They just listened and dreamed. Ras Nahom stood among them, often the last to speak. When he did, his words were as plain as the dirt beneath his feet. A city dies when her children forget each other. Let us begin by remembering. And so, the first chapter of the rebuilding began, not with the laying of bricks, but with the gathering of voices, waiting together in the shadow of destruction for the break of a different kind of mourning.
The gathering of voices.
Word of the Sentinels spread with the quiet, unstoppable momentum of an underground current. It moved through the city's veins via the gossip of taxi drivers who shared stories of a man still inhabiting the lunar landscape of the ruins. A woman selling bread near St. Uriel told her patrons that he scrawled the names of the ancestors onto the walls every night. A security guard from a gleaming new glass tower whispered, that he had seen the air standing motionless in the torrential rain, talking softly to the air as if the wind itself were a witness. Soon, the curiosity turned into a pilgrimage. They came from every cardinal direction, students from Addis Ababa University carrying forbidden questions, Stoic elders from the ancient churches, and women whose homes in Piazza and Arat Kilo had been erased by the same mechanical indifference. They arrived with nothing in their hands but the heavy weight of their stories, and in the ruins, that was the only currency that mattered. The site where 647 had once breathed became their sacred meeting ground.
Mehal, ye, Mehali.
They called the site Mehal, ye, Mehali, the heart of hearts. For that was exactly where it was. It was at the heart of Kazanchi's, Addis Ababa. There was no elevated stage, no colorful banners, and no leader's chair to denote hierarchy. The architecture of the gathering was a circle formed on jagged stones and charred timber. Sometimes a shared kettle of tea provided a meager warmth. Other times, a single bottle of water passed from hand to hand was their only communion. In these circles, the displaced began to remember their true names. They spoke of the old city's texture, the communal ovens, the pre-dawn bells, and the solidarity of the streets. Each voice was a spiritual brick laid back into the foundation of a city that had tried to forget them. The Ras remained largely silent, a vessel for their collective grief. When he finally spoke, his voice was a steady anchor. Our city is not lost. She is merely waiting for us to speak her name with enough love to wake her. They began to call themselves the Keepers of Addis, not an organization, but a blood oath promise to the soil.
The voice spreads.
As weeks turned into months, the gatherings at the rubble began to exert a gravitational pull that the city's authorities could no longer ignore. The silence was being replaced by a sophisticated, quiet roar. A journalist, a woman who had once stood in the same activist circles as Betty, came to the ruins not with a camera, but with a witness's heart. She sat among the ash and wrote down the liturgy of the displaced. Though her article was suppressed by the official state media, branded as a threat to public order, the truth found its own channels. It became an underground manuscript. Copies moved from hand to hand in the back of blue and white taxis. A teacher in a hidden corner of the city used it as a clandestine reading exercise for his students to teach them the meaning of civic virtue. Eventually, the digital dam broke. Someone transcribed Ras Nahom's charcoal scrawls onto the internet, and within weeks, the words were tattooed across the digital consciousness of the nation. Addis belongs to her children. Development without memory is not progress, it is erasure. Honor is the architecture of the soul. The government dismissively labeled it rumor, but in the kitchens of the poor and the dormitories of the students, it was recognized as the only available truth.
Cathedral of the Streets.
The gatherings multiplied. They were no longer confined to the heart of hearts. Like a spilled inkwell, the spirit of Kazanchi's saturated the city. Meetings took place in the dim light of traditional cafes, under the concrete ribs of bridges, and within the skeletal, unfinished apartment blocks on the city's dusty periphery. Wherever people gathered to mourn what had been stolen and to imagine what might yet be reclaimed, the hybrid vision lived. This was not a rebellion of stones and fire. It was a revolution of remembrance turning into civic will. Ras Nahom did not claim the title of leader, yet his name traveled like a blessing. Those who sought him out in the ruins described him as a man of crystalline calm, bare-handed, unhurried, with eyes that seemed to have viewed the very beginning of the Punt and Damat kingdoms and the eventual end of the current tyranny. He never shouted. He never threatened. He simply asked
questions that acted like slow-releasing medicine in the mind. What is a nation, if not its people's collective memory? How can progress inhabit a house where conscience was evicted? If justice does not return to its original hearth, what foundation are we building upon?
Morning gold.
One dawn, following a night of relentless cleansing rain, the sky over Addis Ababa transformed into a sheet of hammered gold. The city's glass towers, usually cold and imposing, shone wet and reflective, and the air carried the intoxicating scent of damp earth rather than the suffocating grit of construction dust. Ras Nahom stood on the plot of 647, watching the golden light climb the sterile walls of the new luxury buildings. He never carried the burden of hate for the stones themselves. He only felt a profound sorrow that they had been built without love. Around him, the keepers of Addis began to materialize from the morning fog. Students, stoic elders, laborers with calloused hands, and widows in white shawls. Someone produced a small Ethiopian flag, the red, green, and gold, frayed at the edges but meticulously clean. They planted it into the soil of the ruins. They had no wealth to offer the city, so they offered her their survival. "We are the memory that refuses to die," Nahom told them, his voice carrying through the clear air. "We will rebuild her with honor. We will make her worthy of her name once more." And the collective answer, "So be it," was not a shout, but a firm, rhythmic pulse.
Hybrid vision.
He called the philosophy hybrid vision because he was the embodiment of the collision between worlds. He had lived in the interstitial spaces between the whispered tales of royalty and the cold reality of rubble, between the grand history of empires and the immediate hunger of the street, between the absolute love for a nation and the sting of her neglect. Hybrid vision was not a theoretical philosophy written in the comfort of a library. It was a blueprint carved by the fire of 647. It was the realization that the future must be constructed from the ruins, not in spite of them. Nahom saw in his own DNA the dual nature of Ethiopia, ancient yet startlingly young, broken yet undeniably divine, forgotten by the world yet eternal in the eyes of God. He was the descendant of an Aksumite royal line and the grandson of a colonel who had served with an incorruptible dignity. From his father, Aina Alim, he inherited a bloodline that traced back to the first empire of light. From his mother, he inherited the unbreakable resilience of those who labor in exile, sending their love and their earnings back across oceans to a land that often forgets them. He realized he was not born to inherit palaces of stone, but to preserve the memory of the values that once dwelt within them.
The unfinished sentence.
"I am made of two times," he would tell the students, "the one that built the empire and the one that burned it down. I am both the witness and the heir, the child and the custodian." The hybrid vision began to solidify into a design, a map drawn from pain, a blueprint built on the preservation of the soul. He imagined a new Addis Ababa rising from the current chaos, not glass towers standing over unmarked graves, but living spaces that breathed with history. He imagined schools named after the invisible heroes like Engish and Abule, and homes returned to the families who had guarded the city's heart for a century. Hybrid vision meant harmony, not the forced erasure of ethnic or religious differences, but their orchestration into a grand national symphony. He understood that Ethiopia's strength was never found in uniformity, but in a diversity bound by a shared, sacrificial love. Every religion, every dialect, and every hue of skin were the essential threads of a single divine cloth. He never viewed any current administration as his only adversary. He identified ignorance as the true tyrant. "The ones who burn houses are not the greatest destroyers," he said. "The ones who forget why those houses were built in the first place are." He began to speak as a surrogate voice for all those silenced, for the colonel, for Imayi Wasine, for the thousands thrown to the cold, nameless edges of the city. Their stories would not end in the tragedy of exile. They would serve as the opening chapter of the return. In the dim blue light of his old laptop screen, sitting amidst the ruins, Ras Nahom finally recognized his own reflection. He was not merely a survivor of a demolition. He was Ethiopia's unfinished sentence, a line of poetry started by the ancestors and interrupted by the machines. Now, he was ready to write the rest of the stanza. The manifesto was no longer just a dream. It was an inevitability. The return has begun.
Ashes to light. The birth of the Zemanite covenant.
At the jagged edge of the ruins, dawn arrived not as a gesture of mercy, but as a solemn summons. The sun rose over the open wounds of Addis Ababa, painting
every broken wall and exposed piece of rebar in a deep liturgical gold. It was as if the light itself were attempting to prove that even destruction could reflect the divine. Nahom stood on the scorched earth that had once been the courtyard of his home. He looked toward the city skyline, where luxury hotels gleamed like fortresses designed for the sole purpose of forgetting, and where construction cranes hung in the morning mist like vultures paused mid-feast. He whispered the name that had been fermenting in his spirit since the first excavator struck. Zemanite, Ethiopia. Ethiopia the timeless. Ethiopia the feminine. Ethiopia the mother who bleeds beneath the bulldozer but refuses to die. This was no longer a mere lament. It was the first breath of a manifesto, a covenant between those who had fallen in the sacking and those who were destined to rise from its ash. This was not politics as usual. It was politics as resurrection.
The resurrection of justice.
The world had spoken too long of progress without a soul and modernity without a memory. Zemanite Ethiopia was designed to be the antidote, a vision of rebirth that honored both the ancient bloodline and the modern blueprint. In Ethiopia, to speak of justice is to summon an army of ghosts. They crowd the corridors of every parliament and every office built upon the stolen soil of the displaced. Justice, in the Zemanite vision, is not an act of state charity. It is the radical return of what was stolen, the home, the dignity, and the history. It is repatriation for the exiled, restitution for the robbed, and a fierce reverence for the dead. Ras Nahom's first internal decree was absolute. Every person exiled by policy must be returned by principle. A comprehensive registry of the displaced would be established. Every home destroyed under the fraudulent mask of development would be meticulously documented. Compensation alone could not heal this wound. Only ownership could. A city cannot claim to be prosperous while the people who built its foundations are sleeping in the dirt of its periphery.
House of Memory.
Zemanite Ethiopia would not begin with the ink of a constitution, but with the grit of remembrance. Memory is the first act of governance, the moral map by which a people navigate toward a future that doesn't repeat the crimes of the past. Nahum imagined a house of memory, built upon the very soil of Kazanchis. Its foundations would be laid with stones salvaged from the demolished homes of the Heart of Hearts. Inside, every wall would act as a living scroll, telling the lore of the capital, from the beginning till the present, and it would tell even the smallest details of the households and families of Kazanchis, like the colonel's incorruptible honor, the scent of Wasin's coffee, and the courage of Betty standing defiantly before the machines. This house would serve as both museum and parliament, a sanctuary where development without humanity is recognized as decay in a suit. "We will not move forward by erasing," wrote Ras Nahum. "We will move forward by carrying every stone, every name, every truth."
Governance by proximity.
From the dust of Kazanchis rose a radical conviction. If the powerful could demolish without consent, then power itself must be reconstructed from the earth up. Zemanite Ethiopia proposed a reformation of proximity. Power should live within shouting distance of the people it claims to serve. The pyramid of the state would be flattened into a circle, a round table modeled after the coffee ceremony, where truth flows as freely as the steam. This would include local councils elected directly by the neighborhood, not appointed by party loyalty. Transparent urban planning where no demolition can occur without a sustained public dialogue. Citizens' courts, where elders and scholars deliberate side by side to protect civil rights. "The problem is not that Ethiopia lacks rulers," he said. "It's that she lacks listeners."
The right to home.
Zemanite Ethiopia declared that the sanctity of the home is an unbreakable covenant. Housing would no longer be treated as mere property or units in a government ledger. It would be treated as heritage, as sacred as the church, as essential as the mosque. This right to home includes 1. The right to shelter that is permanent and dignified. 2. The right to livelihood within one's own ancestral city. 3. The right to cultural inheritance, to speak, worship, and name one's children without the fear of state erasure.
The Cultural Renaissance.
Ras Nahum knew that the real revolution was not one with protests, but with a renewal of the Ethiopian soul. He called for a cultural renaissance, a rebirth of dignity through the arts, music, and moral science. Schools would teach ethos, the science of being human, alongside arithmetic. The new Ethiopia would raise her children to know that humility is a crown, honesty is a weapon, and love of country is not a license to hate others.
Zemanite Ethiopia is not against anyone, Nahum concluded. It is for everyone who believes that a nation's greatness is measured not by the height of its towers, but by the tenderness of its heart.
Out of ashes, light.
I was born in Kazanchis, in the center of the flame, to give the silent ruins a republic and a name. Between the fallen mountains and the spirits none can tame, I was born in Kazanchis. and I have come to claim.
I need not invent a new Ethiopia. I just need to rebuild the one I grew up in.